Hello there and welcome back to Hammer the Backlog, the weekly miniature painting accountability and productivity blog that's also a quarterly video series. My name is Mick, I am the one by whom the backlog gets hammered, and in this video we're going to do our Year 3 Quarter 1 review and our Year 3 Quarter 2 planning session. So if you've been following along with Hammer the Backlog at all over the last 2.5 years, oh my god, that's a long time, you'll know that I use small business productivity and accountability methods to make sure that the 30 years of hoarded Warhammer and other tabletop gaming miniatures that I've accumulated get painted before the police come and arrest me for miniature neglect. So this video is going to take the same format as every other quarterly review video. In part 1, we're going to take a look at the rocks for quarter 1 of year 3. Then we're going to clear these painted miniatures off the table and move on and take a look at the target setting for quarter 2 of year 3. So in quarter 1, I spent almost all of my time painting lumps of white metal from the early to mid to late 90s. So you're going to need to brush off your Sony playing stations, get your Spice Girls CDs ready, and sit down for 5 or 6 minutes of pure 90s nostalgia. So target 1, rock 1 for quarter 1 of year 3 of Hammer the Backlog was to get the majority of my 5th edition metal models painted, photographed and online. Compared to previous quarters, these models are a motley crew of different armies. We've got some lizard men, we've got some dogs of war, and we've even got some Chaos Space Marines. But I'm happy to say for the 9th quarter in a row of Hammer the Backlog, all of this quarter's painting targets were well and truly achieved. Let's spend a couple of minutes looking at each of the units individually, and I'll point out a couple of little things that I'd like to show you about each of them. So the first models I painted up for this quarter, in fact, to be honest, they were almost finished by the end of the last quarter, but they got finished at the start of this quarter. So this is their first video appearance. It is these 5 classic Chaos Space Marines that I've had knocking around in my collection since the early 2000s. Fully painted in a 2nd edition style retro Iron Warriors scheme. I absolutely love these models. They were really fun to paint. I initially thought they would take me a week to paint 5 Hammer the Backlog points, but I ended up spending nearly 2 weeks on them because I enjoyed them so much, and they happened to fall into that little lacuna of time between the end of year 2 and the start of year 3. Luckily, I don't have any more of these, so this project is now finished. The other painting targets for quarter 1 of year 3 were getting my Dogs of War finished, so let's take a look at them. These models were a much more neglected group of models than the Dogs of War I painted last year. Let's be honest, these are the models I avoided painting because they all had some problems. Missing parts, broken parts, incomplete units. They all taunted me to try and get them finished in one way or another. Probably the trickiest of this set were the Birdmen of Catraza. These are 5 Italians on canvas flying machines, and they were, I was going to say they were an absolute joy to paint, but they were a bit of an ass pain, to be honest. They had to be painted separately, and their canvas wings with their wooden struts took me hours and hours of painting. What really bothers me about these models is that there's no position that you can photograph them from that shows the majority of the painting that you actually did. The men are pretty much hidden behind the canvases. The other models I painted were Vespero's Vendetta, 5 duelists. This is the 3rd time painting these, as they were part of my mid-2000s attempts to redo my Dogs of War army. The reason that these were held up for so long was that Vespero himself lost his dueling dagger. In the end, I kind of chickened out a little bit. I took an Empire Free Company arm with a spare dagger and put that on instead. a little bit of painting trickery, and it's very hard to tell. The next unit were Gogfag's Mercenary Ogres. These were my absolute favourite models when I bought them in 1998. I loved the Ogre Mercenary units in Warhammer Dark Omen for the PlayStation. So Ogres were one of the units I was most excited about getting my hands on and painting. I never lost any bits from this set, but the banner bearer's head that came in the box was the wrong one. And that, honest to God, stopped me from finishing this unit for more than 25 years. But now they're done. I took a spare head, I shaved it down, and I gave him a spare Empire Pistolier's helmet. The next unit were these Brazanga's Besiegers with their iconic pavises. This unit was in the worst state of repair of all of my Dogs of War units, and I'm really happy with how these have turned out. First of all, only one of the 3 crossbows originally came with this set. The other 2 I had to hodgepodge together from spares from Pizarro's Lost Legion and the Birdmen. Then I also broke the banner pole and lost the original banner top. So a bit of brass wire and an Empire Knight's helmet substituted in. Finally, I was 1 pavise short, and this was keeping me up at night. Was I going to try and make one? Was I going to try and make one out of plastic card or green stuff? But in the end, good friend and arch nemesis of the channel, Emil from Tankwall's Lair, sent me one with about 3 days left to go in the quarter and saved the day. It wasn't all Dogs of War though. I also had lizard men to paint. First of all, 5 Croxigors, the ogre-sized crocodile lizard men from the 90s book. My lovely lady wife got me these for my birthday last year, and it was a real pleasure to add them to the list. They really fill out my 1,000-point lizard man army nicely. And the final model for this quarter was the Slan Mage Priest on his palanquin with his Temple Guard bodyguards. This is the single biggest chunk of metal I've ever painted, and I forgive everything I said about the Birdmen of Catraza being an arse pain, because this was the most difficult model to work with I've ever experienced. Trying to glue this together was an absolute nightmare. But I'm super happy with how it turned out. I love the scheme, I love how he looks, and I have noticed since I finished painting this that there's something wrong. So 1,000 internet points for the first person in the comments to point out what's wrong with this model. Well, that's it for the painting targets for quarter 1 of year 3, and I'm happy to say fully achieved. But if you've been watching, you know every quarter I like to have a painting target and a meta target. And the meta target for quarter 1 of year 3 was to get the Dark Vengeance video battle report filmed and played. Played and filmed makes more sense. Look, real talk here. This didn't work out. This is, in the 3 years of Hammer the Backlog, the first time that I had a really serious sit down and think about why I was doing something. And I just didn't love making the Dark Vengeance battle report. The Dark Vengeance box set is super cool. The Dark Angels are amazing. The Chaos models are fantastic. But I didn't really get the rush of excitement from finishing that box set. The internet response to it wasn't very popular either. It sits in an awkward spot of being from the year 2012. It's not quite nostalgic, but it's not quite new. The 6th or 7th edition Warhammer 40k rule set isn't different enough from the current rule set to be interesting, like, say, a 2nd edition battle report or a 3rd edition battle report. So I just really dragged my heels on it, and in the end I decided for the first time to kill a rock. Now, as you know, the whole point of this blog is accountability and productivity, and killing a rock wasn't something that I took lightly. But the rock of making that report threatened to drag the whole project down with it, so in the end it was better to get rid of it. So, quarter 1 of year 3, a mitigated success. One rock, the main rock, the painting rock, fully achieved, and the meta rock killed and abandoned. So let's clear these models off the table, put the next 3 trays on the table, and start the target setting session for year 3, quarter 2. And here we are, 3 more trays of unpainted plastic neglect. So I have 3 trays in front of me. You can go back to the year 3 planning session if you'd like to have a look at these trays more in depth. But to sum up, we have the Gene Stealer Cults from the Deathwatch Overkill board game. We've got about 40 plastic modern models here. On this tray, we have the Island of Blood Elves from the 2014, 2010, I'm not sure, Games Workshop 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy Starter Set. Notable by his absence here is the Prince on Griffin, who should be right here, and I assume Editing Mick has added in digitally later. He bloody better have, let me tell you. He's not too lazy. And finally, we have the slightly unusual tray on which we have the 13 Space Marines from Deathwatch Overkill, themselves not enough to justify spending an entire quarter on. So therefore, we have 20 Warhammer Fantasy Battle 7th edition models. In this case, I have the Company of Honor and I have a unit of Phoenix Guard. Although, it must be said, I reserve the right to change the specific 20 fantasy models on that tray when I get to that tray. So, I suppose the question is, which models are next? Well, if you know me in any way, you know I'm a creature of habit, and we have done 1 quarter of fantasy, and I like to do 2 quarters of fantasy and 2 quarters of sci-fi, so that means it's pretty obvious that the next tray is going to be the Warhammer Fantasy Battles 7th edition, 8th edition boxed set Elves, the High Elf Expeditionary Force from the Island of Blood set. As I said, I've left the Prince on Griffin at home for reasons that will become clear later, but in this set we have 10 Swordmasters of Hoeth, 10 Hammer the Backlog points, 1 each. We have 10 Lothern Sea Guard, again, 1 Hammer the Backlog point each, so 10 points in total, even though these are some of the most complicated looking basic infantry models that Games Workshop has ever produced. I suspect that's going to be a tricky 2 weeks. Then we have 5 Reaver Knights. Usually I give cavalry models 3 points, so 2 cavalry models is 6 points, more or less 1 week. In this case, I might just try to get the 5 of these done across 2 weeks. Either painting 2.5 in 1 week and 2.5 the following week, or getting all 5 of them half done in the first week and finishing in the second week. Then we have a mage on foot. He's going to be a full week for himself. We're going to put a lot of effort and attention on him, so he gets 5 Hammer the Backlog points. And then the High Elf Prince on Griffin. I haven't quite decided yet if this is going to be a 2-week or a 3-week job. If it's a 2-week job, the Griffin will be 1 week and the Prince himself will be a 2nd week. So those are the models for this quarter. I also have one last little refugee of a metal model from the 90s. That is the Free Elf Ranger for Mordheim that came with an issue of White Dwarf in the late 90s. And I'm going to try and squeeze him in at some point during this quarter. So not too onerous a painting target, somewhere between 40 and 55 points worth of painting, depending on how long I spend on the Griffin and how long I spend on the Reaver Knights. This is something I'm eager to get started on. But, as you know, every quarter, although last quarter's was a disaster, every quarter I like to have a painting target and a meta target. To decide on the meta target, we go back to the annual planning session. And in the annual planning session, I decided that I wanted to do a follow-up battle report for the Wrath of Tlaxclan battle report that I did last year. Jim and I played a battle between Jim's slimy-eyed lizard men and my noble and French Bretonians, and Jim absolutely walloped me, as he does every time we play tabletop games. Well, I want my revenge. So the quarterly target, the meta target for this quarter is going to be to play a 1,000 point follow-up game for the Wrath of Tlaxclan Battle Report. So there's going to be a little to do to get this done. The lizard men, as you've seen if you've been following me on Instagram or this channel, are done. I have easily 1,000 points of lizard men and they're completely ready to go. The Bretonnians, on the other hand, are a couple of points short of being a full 1,000 point army. They need maybe a general, a battle standard bearer, and a couple of unit leaders. So part of this target is going to be getting all of that done. That's why I'm finally going to get to paint these. These are my Bretonnian Grail Knights. I painted one of them up and he's probably going to be the general for the army, but the other two are going to be unit heroes for my regular Knights of the Realm. The other thing about the Wrath of Tlaxclan Battle Report is we wanted to have a fitting scenic table that makes sense for the battle. In part 1, the lizard men raided a Bretonnian village, so my paper stock Bretonnian buildings and forests made perfect sense. But in part 2, we're going to have the Bretonnians chasing the lizard men back into the jungles with their temples and their pools. So I have quite a bit of building to do. We need to make some Aztec or Mayan style scenery for the lizard men and some proper jungle foliage. So that's it. We have 2 targets for the quarter. Target 1, Rock 1, get the Island of Blood elves painted, photographed and online. And Rock 2, get the Wrath of Tlaxclan follow-up battle report played, filmed, edited and uploaded. That is all for me for this quarter. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please consider giving it a like and a subscribe. I don't know what those buttons do, but apparently it's good. If you've enjoyed looking at all the beautiful models and you don't want to hear or see anything from me, Hammer the Backlog is also on Instagram at hammer_the_backlog. And if you're more of a words person than a listening with your earballs person, Hammer the Backlog is also a weekly blog at www.hammerthebacklog.com. Alrighty then, I will see you in 3 months for a fully completed High Elf army from the Island of Blood starter set and the 4th best Warhammer Fantasy 5th edition battle report you've ever seen. Yeah, that's not too ambitious. 4th best. Thanks though, bye. Good eggs. Finger guns.